Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, the Timberwolves struggle against bad teams. Fact or fiction? We're going to dig into that. I wouldn't call it a complete myth, but are they better against good teams? Well, not necessarily. We'll dig into what they've done so far, the path to 41-32, which is where the Wolves sit now, and we'll also predict the final 9 games of the year. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Happy Thursday, everybody. Timberwolves still aren't playing. 3 straight days off. The Wolves play tomorrow night. Tomorrow we'll focus on previewing that game. Today, I want to take a peek backward and look at how the Wolves have gotten to 41-32. There's kind of this prevailing thought that they play down or up to their competition, and it's true to an extent. I'll explain what I mean by that. I pulled their records against like non-playoff teams, or like teams that are already out of the playoffs, the league's worst teams, kind of fringy playoff play-in teams, actual play-in teams, top-tier teams in both conferences, and also some of the differentials on either end of the floor. Are they struggling against top offenses, top defenses, etc.? We'll dig into that a bit. It's actually pretty interesting and not exactly what I expected when I set out on that journey. We'll also peek ahead at the final 9 games, a bit of a mix of difficult games and games that should be easy for the Wolves. But again, we all know how that can go for the Wolves. So that's what we'll do today on the show. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder, you can subscribe to the daily Locked On Wolves newsletter at lockedondaily.com. You'll get an email to your inbox every day, Monday through Friday. It's a one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now. Again, that's at lockedondaily.com. All right, so the kind of like prevailing wisdom about the Wolves is, man, they were playing so good against these good teams. You know, they play Boston tough, and they've been good against OKC, playing them tough and splitting that 4-game series. But, they're bad against, like, they lost to the Wizards, right? Well, there's obviously a lot like in today's NBA, you have to look at who played and who didn't in some of these games, right? Like, obviously, Ant didn't play in that Wizards loss, and they still only lost by a bucket. Is it as bad as it looks? So there's some of that, but I don't think it's super fruitful to dig into, like, well, they're 2-2 against this team, but this guy played and this guy didn't play. Like, we'll do that when we get to the playoffs with some of these individual matchups. Remember last year, I want to say it was the Mavs matchup, where in the regular season, like, Ant missed a half, left at halftime for 1 game, and Luka missed a game, and Kyrie missed 2 games. And like, it was just kind of a weird thing to try and parse going into the playoffs. We're not going to do that today with all, other 29 teams, but I wanted to start by looking at the individual units. And like, has the Wolves offensive unit struggled against top defensive units or vice versa? And there's only one real outlier, which is fascinating to me. And what I mean by that is, so here's an example. The Timberwolves defense, which is still a top 10 unit against opposing offenses, they are 10th against top 10 opposing offenses, according to Cleaning the Glass numbers. Okay. So that's okay. That's fine. Right. Overall for the season, Minnesota's 5th defensive rating. So they're 10th against top 10 offenses. It's expected, of course, that you'd be worse against the best offenses than the worst offenses, right? So it's not that bad. And actual points per possession wise is not that big of a dip. So being 10th against the top 10 offenses isn't horrible. Again, 5th overall this season. Against the bottom 10 offenses, I expected this would be worse. It's not. They're 4th against bottom 10 offenses. So they're slightly better against bottom 10 offenses than they are overall. So then I was like, okay, well, they're probably not as good against middle offenses, because it feels like they're losing to some of these middle of the pack teams when they shouldn't be. Nope, they're 4th against the middle 10 group on Cleaning the Glass offensively. So 4th against the bottom, 10th against the top, and 4th against the middle. All that averages together, or works together to average out to being 5th overall. So the defense, we're not seeing a drastic difference. And that's one where you could convince me that like we could dig a bit further and, the month or so that they didn't have Rudy, or I guess less than that because the All-Star break was in there, less than a month's worth of games, 8 or 9 games that Gobert missed. We could like pull those games individually. I'm not going to do that. Overall, body of work, 5th overall defense. And that kind of sort of tracks. Where I was surprised is on the offensive side of the ball. So the Timberwolves offense against top 10 defenses is 5th overall in the league. I should also say that currently the Wolves are 10th in offense. They were 9th. They fell to 11th after the recent, 3 out of 4 games debacle after not playing the last couple of days. As of this recording, they're 10th in the NBA, actually tied for 10th with Milwaukee in offense. They're still kind of barely a top 10 offensive rating on cleaning the glass. So 10th overall. Against top 10 defenses, they're actually 5th. So they do play up to their competition when it comes to opposing top defenses. Again, some flukiness in there probably, but that's good. So then I was like, all right, okay. Well, they lost to Washington. Like, they struggled against Portland this year. Like, I bet they're bad against, not bad, but worse against bottom 10 defenses. No, they're 6th against bottom 10 defenses. So yeah, they're one spot worse than they are against top 10, and you'd like them to be better than 6th against bottom 10 defenses, but you can live with that. And we'll talk about their record against bad teams here in a minute. It's actually not that bad overall. So they're 5th against top 10 defenses. They're 6th against bottom 10 defenses. What about middle 10 defenses? And I'll give you some examples of who those teams are here in a second. They are 23rd offensively against the middle 10 defenses in the league. That's their only non-top 10 ranking. So again, their defense against opposing offenses, offense against opposing defenses into thirds. So 6 possible categories. They're top 10 in the other 5. The only one that they're not top 10 in is the middle against the middle 10 defenses league wide. So and this is of course when they played those defenses. So there's going to be a bit of fluctuation here in terms of who classifies as a middle 10 defense, but I'll give you who they are right now. Miami, Milwaukee, the Lakers, the Pacers, that tracks, the Knicks, Toronto, Atlanta, Portland, Chicago, and Dallas. That feels about right. I didn't pull those exact records against that middle third, but I can tell you right now, I have them basically all in front of me. I mean, they've been bad against Memphis. They've still got one more game against Memphis, but they're currently 0-2 against Memphis. They're right now they're 10th defensively, I guess. Against Miami, they 1-1, and they lost to a shorthanded Heat team early in the season. They're 0-1 against Milwaukee. Against the Lakers, they're 2-2, and that's, obviously the Lakers have had a tale of 2 seasons in a sense. They're 0-2 against the Pacers. They just had 2 bad losses, overtime loss to a shorthanded Pacers team, and then a blowout loss. They're 1-1 against the Knicks, a blowout loss and blowout win. Against Toronto, they're 1-1. Atlanta, I believe they're 1-1 against Atlanta as well. Portland, 2-2, and they shouldn't be. Chicago, 1-1. And Dallas is just kind of a weird one all the way around, but currently 2-1 against Dallas. That's actually the only team that have a winning record against in the middle third of the defensive pack. And we could drill down a bit further and try and figure out why that is. Like, what are these teams good at that the Wolves are bad at? Like, Atlanta forces turnovers, the Wolves turn the ball over a lot. Like, there's some of that stuff, but you could find that anywhere. So I don't know what the common thread there is. And taking this a layer further, we're going to look at the actual, I'm going to break the standings up into tiers, and we're going to look at what's the kind of segment of the standings the Wolves have struggled against the most. And again, this all makes sense when you stop and think about it, but it pushes back against they've struggled against these bad teams. And part of the frustration is, they're 6th offensively against the bottom tier. Should they be 3rd? Yeah, probably. Would that give them an extra win or two? Probably. But why have they been so bad against this middle of the pack in the league? Why are they 23rd against defenses like the Bucks, Pacers, Lakers, Knicks, Raptors, Hawks? It's just a goofy thing that's really kind of dragged down their season. To be top 10 against opposing top 10 units on both ends of the floor and bottom 10 units on both ends of the floor, and to be 23rd against middle of the pack defenses is so strange. I want to look at actual records against eliminated teams in both conferences, play-in teams in both conferences, teams that are on the fringe of the play-in, and then actual like the good teams in both conferences. So we'll do that here next, and then we'll close by I'll predict the last 9 games of the season and predict kind of where the Wolves' final schedule or final record, I should say, where that'll be. So we'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. March Madness is here. Games start back up today. And FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers could get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. Of course, I would say probably the best game of the first round was that Colorado State loss with the double buzzer beaters there at the end on, I guess that was Sunday. It was the end of the second round last weekend. Of course, the Colorado State coach down in Minnesota. But I mean, like at this point, your bracket might be busted. Probably is busted. Look at FanDuel and have some fun here as the tournament kicks back off today. Tournament games every day now through Sunday. Of course, there's always something exciting to bet on. And of course, the FanDuel app is super simple to use, easy and fast. When you win, you get paid instantly with no waiting around. Visit FanDuel.com. Get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. All right. So record-wise against the different tiers in the league, I started with the bottom of the league because I honestly thought like, hey, I'll find something here. This will be a quick like, hey, they've been bad against bad teams. That's not necessarily the case. Okay. Against the 4 teams in the NBA that have already been eliminated from playoff contention. And to be clear, like, I mean, I guess in the West, the Spurs and Blazers are both 3 games out. So I guess they're kind of sort of still in it. The Nets are about to be eliminated. They're 8.5 games out. Same with the Sixers. And there's basically 9-10 games left. So they're basically out. But sitting here right now, there's 4 teams that have been completely eliminated. That's Charlotte, Washington, the Pelicans, and the Jazz. Okay, I was expecting them to be worse against these teams. They're not. They're actually a collective 7-3 against the 4 teams that have been eliminated. Would it be nice to be 8-2? Yes. And realistically, I think it's fair to expect to win 80% of your games. Again, putting aside who played, who didn't play against the bottom tier of teams. So the 7-3 is slightly disappointing, but it's not awful. The one Washington game we know Ant didn't play. They still almost won that game. The Pelicans game that they lost was a bit of a debacle given the state that the Pelicans are in at this point. And the Utah game they lost, they also were missing Ant because he was suspended. So 7-3 against the bottom 4 teams in the entire NBA, and Ant missed 2 of the 3 losses. Okay? So we'll set that aside. It's not awful. It could be a lot worse. So then I went and I looked at non-play-in teams in each conference. So in the West, currently that's Dallas, although they're tied with Phoenix for the 10 spot, but it's Dallas, Portland, and San Antonio. In the East, it's Toronto, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn. Well, in the East, they've only played those 3 teams a combined 3 times. They've still got 1 game against the Sixers, and they haven't played the Nets at all yet, which is a super weird schedule quirk. They have 2 games coming up against Brooklyn. They're currently 2-1 against those 3 teams. They beat Toronto once, lost to Toronto once, which is not great, and beat the Sixers once. They're 2-1 against those 3 teams with 3 remaining. In the West, good, not great. Obviously, that group in the West is much stronger. All 3 of those teams are 31 wins or more. In the East, all 3 of those teams are between 23 and 26 wins. So it's a stronger group in the West, and you include the Mavs in there who beat the Wolves with Luka early in the season. That group is 7. They're 7-4 against the non-play-in teams in the West. And you could sub out and in Dallas and Phoenix because they're tied, and that changes the dynamic a little bit because they're undefeated against the Suns. But at the moment, if you include Dallas there, they're 7-4 against that grouping. Again, like, it's fair to expect them to be 1 game better against that group. And I guess that's kind of the theme here this season is like the Wolves haven't been bad. We just thought they'd be a little bit better. And I think that's, if you could sum up the season in one kind of like half-hearted sort of phrase, I think that's what it would be. Okay, if you look at play-in teams on either side, in the East, the play-in teams are pretty well locked in. There's 5 games between 6 and 7, and there's 5.5 games between 10 and 11. So these are your 4 play-in teams. Who knows what order they'll finish in. Atlanta, Orlando, Chicago, and Miami. Against that group, I actually thought this would be worse. The Wolves finished, because they're done with this group of teams, they finished 6-2 against the Hawks, Bulls, Magic, and Heat. 6-2. The bad loss to Miami early in the season with no Jimmy Butler. There was somebody else that was out for them too, I think. It was just a bad, close loss, an ugly game. They scored like 95 points. That was a bad loss. The other loss was against the Hawks, which was like right before Christmas. The third in a 3-game losing streak. It was a really bad performance by the Wolves. They lost by 13 on the road. Bad ant game, like just an ugly game. So they finished 6-2 against that group, which I think is fine. That's not a bad group of teams. I guess they're all under 500. So, but 6-2 is fine. I don't have a huge problem with it. Now you look in the West, and it's very much a mixed bag. They're 3-0 against the Suns. They're 2-2 against the Kings, which is fine. I think the Kings are a tough matchup for Minnesota. They have been the last few years. And the Kings have had a very topsy-turvy season, firing their coach, then playing really well, then playing really poorly. It's been a very weird Kings year. So they're 2-2 against the Kings, 3-0 against the Suns, and a terrible 1-3 against the Warriors. And this is another one where the Clippers are at 6 and they're 3-0 against the Clippers. So you could flip those and it looks a lot different. But sitting here right now against the other 3 teams in the play-in, the Timberwolves are 3-0 against Phoenix, 1-3 against Golden State, 2-2 against Sacramento. So they're combined 6-5 against other play-in teams. So not great, but maybe kind of sort of to be expected. And then you look at the top tier teams in either conference. And in the West, the Wolves are pretty good against the top tier. We've talked about how they're 2-2 against OKC. They're 2-2 against Houston. Those are the top 2 teams in the West. You can handle that, right? That's not the end of the world. The Nuggets are third. The Wolves are good against the Nuggets. 2-0 against Denver. 1 still to play against the Nuggets. The Lakers are fourth. The Wolves played the Lakers to 2-2. And again, very odd season for the Lakers. They've been bad against Memphis. 0-2 against the Grizzlies with 1 still to play. And then not currently, they're done with the Clippers. 3-0 against the Clippers. So that's about what you'd want it to be. Memphis is the only team that they have a losing record against. To be 4-4 against the top 2 teams in the West, and if you want to go top 3 and add in the Nuggets, they're currently 6-4 against the top 3 teams in the West. And that's a record you'll take. The only team top 6 in the West that they have a losing record against is 0-2 against Memphis. You could go top 7 and add in Golden State, and then it would be Memphis and Golden State. That's not terrible. You can handle that. But then you look at the top of the Eastern Conference, and that's where things completely fall apart. Against the top 6 teams in the Eastern Conference, this absolutely floored me. The Wolves are 1-9 against the top 6 teams in the Eastern Conference. 1-9. Their only win coming in a blowout win against the Knicks. 1-9. Still a couple to play. They play Detroit upcoming this weekend. They play Milwaukee next week. Those are their 2 remaining games. So best case is they're 3-9 against the top 6 teams in the East. And this is very strange because the top 6 in the East, at least record-wise, are not as good as the top 6 in the West. And the other thing that's interesting here is how they played these teams. So Cleveland's basically blown the Wolves out twice. 2 losses by a combined 28 points, margin of victory for the Cavs. The Wolves have lost twice to Boston with a combined margin of defeat of only 5 points. They played Boston really tough. The Knicks, who are third in the East, they blew them out once. The Knicks blew the Wolves out once. That's a wash. They had 2 games against the Pacers, the overtime close loss to a depleted Pacers team with only 1 starter, and then pretty much a blowout loss last week. They lost by 16 to the Pacers that time. Their loss to the Pistons, which looks less bad now because Detroit has an identical record to the Wolves, was by 14 at the beginning of January. And then they had a 2-point loss to Milwaukee several weeks ago. So again, a mixed bag, blowout losses to the Knicks, Pacers, and twice to the Cavs, but playing the Celtics close twice, playing the Pacers close, a depleted Pacers team close once, and then, blowing out the Knicks once. But going 1-9 against the top tier in the East, that feels kind of fluky since they've been so good against the top tier in the West. So again, I think it's interesting because how many of those top tier teams in the East fall into that middle of the pack defensively that we just talked about? Well, I'll tell you, Detroit, the Pacers, the Knicks, and the Bucks. So 4 of those 6 teams. And what have the Wolves done against those 4 teams? They've won exactly 1 game between the Knicks, Pacers, Pistons, and Bucks. To date, they're 1-5 against those 4 teams. And so it makes sense. The poor offense against mediocre defenses is going to lead to a 1-6 record against that group of teams, 1-5 record against that group of teams. So, I don't know what conclusion to draw from this other than it's a little fluky. The Wolves don't fully take some opponents seriously. That's clear. And at the time, again, taking this a layer further, the Pistons were thought to be worse. They were around 500 when the Wolves lost to them, but they're now 9 games above 500. The Bucks were struggling a little bit at the time. They're better now. The Pacers, the first game they lost to them, depleted, fluky in the Obi Toppin. Well, actually, both games, fluky Obi Toppin games. But then they get up for teams like Boston. Cleveland's a bad matchup. If the Wolves somehow got to the finals and faced the Cavs, that's a tough matchup for the Wolves. Boston, they play tough. The Knicks, they got up for at least one of those Knicks games because of the cat element, I'm sure. And in the West, they clearly are taking everybody seriously. Memphis has always been a tough matchup for Minnesota. The Golden State thing, they lost to a depleted Golden State team. At least one of those 3 losses was against a team that had a bunch of guys out, post trades and all that stuff. So I still think the not taking teams seriously threat is a real thing. I just think it's more with undermanned teams, teams that are missing guys, more so than it is against bad teams. 7-3 against the worst 4 teams in the NBA. You'd love that to be 8-2, right? The non-play-in, likely non-playoff teams, you'd like that to be a game better. And you got to believe they should be better than 1-9 against the top teams in the East. And you figure you pick up another 4 or 5 wins there, and they're right in the 3, 4, 5 conversation in the West, which is where we all thought they'd be this season anyway. Point differential wise, like we talked about this a bunch, Minnesota's actually still 4th in the West. They're behind only OKC, Houston, and Memphis in terms of point differential. They're ahead of Denver. They're ahead of the Lakers by far. They're ahead of the Clippers, who they've beaten 3 times in point differential. I know that's not what matters, but these close late games are adding up, the ones that they're losing. And you can add the Boston games. You can add, one of those Pacers games, the Bucks loss. Like, those are all part of that. So I guess with all that in mind, I'm going to predict the last 9 games, where the Wolves end up in the West. I'm still pretty bullish on them getting out of the play-in, and I'll explain why here in a minute. But a little bit of a fluky season schedule-wise, not a ton of real conclusions to draw, other than they've been bad offensively against middle-tier defensive teams, and that's really hurt them this season. All right, we'll predict the last 9 games of the season upcoming here next. Okay, so the Timberwolves are in action tomorrow night, taking on the Phoenix Suns, who currently they're 3-0 against. And going back to last year, remember, they were awful in the regular season. They got blown out in the regular season finale when there was something on the line. And then they swept the Suns, basically blew them out in the first round last year in the playoffs in the 3-6 matchup. And then they've beaten them 3 times the regular season now. So they're 7-0 in their last 7 games against Phoenix, which makes me a little bit nervous, frankly. But what went from a bad matchup for Minnesota, went from a bad matchup for Minnesota, what was thought to be a bad matchup last year because of the mid-range efficiency of the Suns and what the shots the Wolves are willing to give up. Really, the Timberwolves' size advantage has been huge, and their activity level has been huge against an older, I guess, slower, smaller Phoenix team. So I think they'll win Friday night, even though it makes me a little nervous. Also, coming off of 3 days of rest makes me a little nervous. But I think they win Friday. I think they beat the Pistons Sunday, even though it's a tough matchup. I just think they're going to figure this thing out. I don't like the Denver spot next week. They get up for Denver. They played Denver great this year. They're 2-0 against Denver. They won in 7 games last year in the playoffs. But the Nuggets, the Wolves aren't going to go 3-0 against the Nuggets. So I think Denver wins that game next week. I think the Wolves win at Brooklyn and Philadelphia. I think they lose at Milwaukee. That's a tough matchup for Minnesota. I think they lose at Memphis because they struggle with Memphis. And then I think they win their last 2 games against Brooklyn and Utah. So over their final 9 games, that means I have the Wolves losing to Milwaukee, Memphis, and Denver and winning the rest of their games. So I have them going 6-3 in their final 9, which puts them at 47 wins on the season, 47-35. 47-35, I think, would be enough for Minnesota to get to 6 in the West. Now, the Clippers and Warriors have flipped. They actually have the exact same record. So Clippers and Warriors are tied for 6. The Wolves are a half game back. They played one more game still heading into play on Thursday. So they're a half game behind. A full, in the loss column is where that lands. The Clippers beat the Knicks on Wednesday. The Warriors have lost 2 straight. So right now, the Clippers, Warriors, and Wolves are all within a game of each other. And remember, the Wolves are 3-0 against the Clippers and have that tiebreaker, and they're 1-3 against Golden State and do not have that tiebreaker. So if the Wolves and Clippers tie for 6, the Wolves get 6. If the Wolves and Warriors tie for 6, the Wolves get 7. If there's a 3-way tie, I believe the first tiebreaker is conference record, which the Wolves win. I meant to say that earlier. Minnesota still has the 3rd best record in the Western Conference against the Western Conference, behind only OKC and the Lakers. They've got a better record, or more wins, I should say, against the West than Houston, than Denver. They also have more losses, so I guess maybe that could even out a little bit. But conference record, they are for sure going to win that against the Clippers and Warriors. So if that is the tiebreaker, which I think it is, and if it's divisional record, the Wolves have that as well. So they would win a 3-way tie. They would win a head-to-head against the Clippers. They would not win a head-to-head against the Warriors. Okay? All that to say, I still believe the Wolves end up 6th in the West. 5th is looking much less likely. They're now 3.5 behind the Grizzlies with 9 to play for Minnesota and 10 to play for the Grizzlies. Not out of the question. They can't win that tiebreaker. They've got 1 game against Memphis, but they're already 0-2 against them, so they're not going to win that tiebreaker. And the Lakers are actually tied 4th and 5th, Memphis and LA. So they're also only 3.5 games out of 4th. I don't think that happens. That's a tough thing to do with only 9 games left for the Wolves and 10 games for each of those teams. So I think my prediction is they end up 6th. I haven't dug into the Clippers and Warriors schedules to see who's tougher, who has a tougher sledding. But if they're 6th, they're going to play probably either Houston or Denver in the 3-6 game. And against those teams, the Wolves are 2-2 against Houston, currently 2-0 against Denver. I actually do like their matchup against Denver better, but at the same time, in the playoffs, as a general rule of thumb, you want to avoid the best player, like the best individual player. Of course, that's Jokic. I am not going to say I want the Wolves to play the Nuggets in the first round. I'm not going to say that. I refuse to say it. But those matchups, I generally like how the Wolves match up with Denver more than I like how they match up with Houston. And at the moment, Houston's got a 1.5 game lead on the 2 spot in the West. So if the Wolves end up 6th, the most likely scenario is they would play Denver. It's still possible it could be the Lakers. It's possible it could be Memphis. It's possible it could be Houston. So a ton to be decided. But like, if I had to predict what I think will happen, I think the Wolves finish 6th, and I think they play Denver in the first round. A lot of things could look different. They could finish 8th and play the Warriors in the play-in. They could finish 8th and play the Clippers in the play-in. They could finish 7th and play one of those teams. They could finish 6th and play Houston, the Lakers, or the Grizzlies. So a lot of possibilities. But again, the Wolves have a very palatable schedule. Difficult games at Memphis and Milwaukee and Denver. But the home schedule against Phoenix, Detroit, Brooklyn, and Utah, they have to go at least 3-1 in that schedule. And I just predicted they'd win all 4 of those, which I realize is bold considering how they've struggled at home, relatively speaking, this year. But that's how I see this shaking out here to close the season. A lot of fun basketball yet to be played. Friday show, we'll preview the Suns matchup. We'll talk about what the Wolves have done so well over the last 7 games against Phoenix. We'll spend quite a bit of time on that. Also look ahead to the Detroit game Sunday, since we see the Pistons very infrequently, and it's been since January 4th since we saw the Pistons last. So we'll talk about that on Friday's show as well, and we'll set you up for next week. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder, you can subscribe to the daily newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. It's one stop for ultimate Wolves and NBA coverage delivered right to your inbox daily, Monday through Friday. Subscribe at LockedOnDaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.